President Uhuru Kenyatta today leads the nation in celebrating KDF Day to pay tribute to fallen soldiers. The day will be marked this year, coinciding with the 5 years after the Operation Lindanchi began. Today's celebration will be held at the Mtongwe Naval Base in Mombasa. It comes even as questions linger on the exact number of soldiers Kenya lost in the LRD attack earlier this year. So that story on KDF Day forms the basis of a Twitter poll question this morning. We're trying to pick your mind with respect to the security of the nation, and we're asking you, has the presence of KDF troops in Somalia been of help to Kenyan security? What are your thoughts? You've observed what has happened in the country in the last 5 years or so, and it has been an international concern. The war against terror is now an international concern. So do you think the presence of KDF troops has helped the security situation in Kenya? Tweeters at KTN News. Tweet me at Linda Gutu. Please use the hashtag News Center so that I'm able to track your feedback on a Twitter poll question this morning. Let's now focus on a story that is linked to the KDF Day. Medical charity group Doctors Without Borders, MSF, say a vast majority of refugees do not want to go back to Somalia. The group says Kenya should therefore consider alternatives to closing down the Dadaab camp. Many refugees surveyed cited by the charity list their main concern as fear of forced recruitment into armed groups and the threat of sexual violence. Other concerns are the absence of healthcare facilities in Somalia. Kenya is in the process of repatriating Somali refugees from the Dadaab camp ahead of its closure in November. So let's have a conversation about this in studio with me. And we're focusing on that report that was released by doctors, by MSF actually. That report was titled Dadaab to Somalia, pushed back into the peril. Let's speak to Head of Mission MSF here, Lisbeth Albrecht. She joins us in studio this morning. Ma'am, good morning.
Good morning,
to see you. So let's talk a little bit about this report that you released. A good number of Somali refugees do not want to go back home. Apart from the reasons that we have listed at the intro, what are other concerns that are coming up, that came up from what you the study that you guys did?
The study that we did. So maybe to explain a little bit the study, we have been working for years in the Dadaab camps, in one camp in particularly called Dakahale, and we actually organized focus group discussions with the refugees and did a survey. You know, we thought it was important to get the voice of the refugees out on this. And so about 86%, so it's more than a vast majority, it's actually almost all of them actually expressed their...
So basically just 14 are okay?
Yeah.
14%?
14%,
okay.
Yeah. And so for sure, the number one concern they have is the insecurity. And among them, you know, the obvious ones of attacks, banditry, but the strong one coming out is, as you have mentioned, the risk of forced recruitment into armed groups. And among them, we also clearly want to bring forward the risk of sexual violence, you know, being a medical organization, because it is a risk that also requires medical assistance on the way. So that's, they're afraid of that both during travel back to Somalia and when living in Somalia. And then the other main concerns is they are very worried about what they can expect in terms of basic services on the other side. For sure, education is a major concern for them, and then the lack of health services.
Okay, let's look inside looking out, because you've just mentioned that you work in a camp in Somalia. If you were to give your assessment... in Dadaab. Yeah. If you were to give your assessment of the stability in Somalia, what sort of assessment would you give it?
Yeah, well, there's the obvious knowledge about Somalia, a country where still 1.1 million people are displaced inside the country, 900,000 refugees living in neighboring countries. The UN itself has recently stated that about 5 million people in Somalia are at risk of hunger because of La Nina and the drought. Somalia, which is very prone to drought and outbreak of diseases. So we also know that the healthcare system has collapsed. What is maybe important to highlight also, Linda, is that the majority of the refugees in Dadaab are from central and southern Somalia. Yeah.
Okay.
So where large parts of that area remain very unstable, insecure. I mean, today's KDF Day, I don't think it requires a lot of explanation. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the voluntary repatriation, because from what we understand, there were consultations between UNHCR and the government of Kenya, and I'm assuming that at some point they brought in the refugees as well, just to pick their minds on whether or not they would want to go home. Was there consultation? How is this voluntary repatriation being carried out from where you sit?
Yeah. So actually the tripartite agreement between the government of Kenya, the government of Somalia and the UNHCR was signed in November 2013.
Yes.
Yeah, so this to actually also define the conditions and the package and the conditions both from the point of departure and then working on conditions to be relevant. To say ready in Somalia, to receive the returnees, and you know that very few actually did return over the first 2.5 years. In this year, so far, 24,000 have returned, but the consultation from the refugees, well, we've consulted the refugees. UNHCR has also consulted the refugees when they did a population verification exercise in August. As many as 75% also expressed their concerns. Yeah, they are not willing to return. They will not sign up to the voluntary repatriation because everybody insists that this process will be voluntary, which then, of course, is very contradictory to having a 30th of November deadline for the closure of the camps.
Okay, so the Kenyan government is on record saying it will close the Dadaab refugee camp. So where do we go from here? Because refugees are saying they're not comfortable going back home. The Kenyan government says we are closing down Dadaab. What next?
Well, what next?
What are the alternatives, in other words?
What are the alternatives? Yeah. Well, the first call we are making, us and the refugees and many other parties, is to come back on that deadline. Yeah. It would, by the way, be logistically impossible to still make that. And it's also worth mentioning that at the moment the repatriation is kind of on hold because also the Jubaland administration has said, hold on a second, we are not ready to receive the returnees with, all the challenges and the problems that we have in this area. So that is number one. Yeah. I mean, this closure on the 30th of November is just not realistic. And secondly, we are strongly calling, let's work on alternative solutions, and there are quite obvious ones. Number one, to increase the quota and the opportunities for refugees to resettle to third countries. So that's a call on the entire international community to also take on their share.
That would actually be an excellent idea, but then the question is, are international communities willing to take them in?
Yeah, well, so there's been a very clear call made, and the response has been very disappointing so far. A second possible alternative is maybe to look at setting up smaller, more manageable camps in more secure areas in Kenya. And a third one that it's really time to start discussing is to create these opportunities for the refugees to become more self-reliant in Kenya and to integrate in Kenya. And there as well, Kenya will need the support of the international donor community to fund this.
Yeah, because that has been the concern. Kenyan officials saying we have had this camp on our soil for years. And maybe it's time, putting in mind the kind of work that has been done in Somalia, maybe it's time the refugees go back. Allow me to put you a little bit on the spot, because there's a report that was released by UNHCR, and they're quite clear that the refugees are willing to go back home. So what changed in the middle?
The report of UNHCR that was published a couple of weeks also says clearly that 75% of the refugees are not willing to go home. Yeah.
So them they're saying 75, you guys are saying
Yeah,
86.
you know, we did the survey in Dakahale, in one of the camps, which definitely is one of the camps that hosts the highest population that's been there for over 20 years. You have the camps like Ifo2 and Cambios, which was set up after the 2011 crisis and emergency. So it also needs to be put in perspective. Maybe those refugees who arrived later on, maybe more of them, I mean, still have links to the home country. I mean, honestly, so many refugees were born in the camps, yeah?
Yeah, this is the only home they know.
This is the only home they know, yeah.
So the Kenyan government is categorical. We're closing the camp. The refugees are saying, we're not willing to go back. We're not so sure of our security. We're not so sure we'll be able to feed ourselves, get medical attention, send our children to school. In the event that no solution is arrived at, of course, we are foreseeing a scenario where they will be compelled to go back to Somalia. Is that a situation you envision, and what goes through your mind when you think about it?
Well, we think, because it's not only all the refugees don't want, it is a fact, you know, that basic services are non-existent on the other side, that it is a very insecure area. If not, there would be no need for AMISOM troops and KDF forces inside the country. So what we envision is another humanitarian crisis. You know, if tomorrow, if this drought evolves into another famine, it's, you know, we envision that this is going to cost the lives of hundreds of people. That is, yeah.
Okay, I'll talk to you about something else that's bothering my mind. Yeah. But for now, let's take a look at our super wall. There are some statistics there with respect to Somali refugees and the fact that they're being asked to go back to Somalia, voluntary repatriation, if you like. So these are some of the fears that the refugees have with respect to going back to Somalia. So 97.5% say they fear the risk of forced recruitment into armed groups. So we do know that Al-Shabaab group is in Somalia, and they do lots of recruitment, especially of young men. So the refugees fear being forced into recruitment into armed groups. 97%, both male and female, say there's the risk of sexual violence if they go back to Somalia. This is actually alarming. 90.5 rate the risk of sexual violence high during travel. So those are just some of the fears that some of these refugees have. Lisbeth, 97%, both male and female, say risk of sexual violence is high. 90.5% rate the risk of sexual violence high during travel. During travel, explain that to me.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's during the travel up to the destination. You know, UNHCR has considered in this voluntary repatriation scheme that there's 9 different destinations in Somalia the refugees can return to. That it is in general very common that, you know, people on the move, people being displaced, people are at much higher risk of sexual violence.
But then I would expect if these are people who are going back home voluntarily, there would be security.
That is what you would expect. Yeah.
Yeah, that is what I would expect. These are people who are going back to their home voluntarily after staying in Kenya for years, so probably they would have some sort of security to be able to get to where they're going, at least on transit.
Yeah, this is also the fears which are expressed by the 86% who are saying they are not willing to go home. And why? Because of these fears.
Yeah. Okay, hold on. Let's take a look at another board as well. Still focusing on the fears of some of these refugees. Health fears, Lisbeth was talking a little bit about this. So 84.8% say health services will not be available. 30% have a household member with a chronic condition. 20% have a household member who needs mental help or mental care. Listen, Lisbeth, by the time this tripartite agreement was being drafted between the UNHCR, between the government of Somalia and indeed the Kenyan government, surely someone should have sat down and looked at all these facilities and said, okay, fine, in the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, you guys are going to go back. What are you going back to? Yeah, because that is what someone would expect. Someone would sit back and say, by the time they'll be going back, we'll have this number of hospitals, we'll have this number of schools, there will be this security. That didn't happen, did it?
Well, as far as we know, we are asking exactly the same questions. No, you would expect. So, I mean, because the practicalities of it today, for example, just a couple of weeks, we had a family that wanted to return voluntarily. Their 16-year-old son has diabetes, has been on insulin for 6 years. They wanted to go back to Baidoa. So we start asking, okay, where can they find the treatment for the diabetic son on the other side, you know? Give a practical example. The public hospital in Baidoa does not have any services for diabetes patients. We started looking, you know, some of the relatives of the family, some former refugee health staff working with us in the camp happened to have moved back. He said, I'll start looking. Okay, finally we find the insulin in a private pharmacy at quite a high cost.
At a high cost, of
Next step, okay, we need to look for the glucometer strips. So they start looking. This gentleman says, I will call you back the following day. The following day, there is an armed attack on Baidoa and an explosion. No, that is the reality, Linda.
On the ground.
And that's a family, that is one family with a diabetic son, a family of 12, a household of 12. In the end, they did go back. They're trying to make a life there now. They're very worried. They're very concerned. We have other relatives who've come to the clinic, our clinic, to ask if maybe we can somehow still send them the medical supplies. And so they are rather desperate today and wondering if at all they can stay on that end.
Lisbeth, is quite unfortunate because no one asks to be a refugee. You wake up one morning and something goes wrong in your country and you realize, oh my God, I'm a refugee, and suddenly you don't have a choice, you have to leave. And those are just some of the fears that they're going through. So Lisbeth, way out. How do we sort this out? The refugees saying they're not really ready to go back, and you've done your study and you're saying there's certain issues they're raising, which are actually genuine. Where do we go from here?
Well,
in terms
the
of
way forward would
here.
be, let's start working on these alternative solutions. MSF is definitely, has also said for years, these massive refugee camps are not the solution for what is now a 25-year protracted crisis.
Wow.
It's 25 years. That is, it's not a solution. But working on these alternative solutions needs time. We are going around the world, you know, our offices in New York, in Paris, in Brussels, in Geneva, as we speak, to also present this to the diplomatic missions and say, you know, it's time for you to share the burden with Kenya, who honestly Kenya for decades now has hosted hundreds of thousands
has spoken about
refugees.
that, the deputy president as well.
But this is not, you know, this is not the time to stop giving the example to the world.
I hear you.
It can't
Trust
be an
me.
option.
Head of Mission MSF in Kenya, Lisbeth Albrecht, thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you, Linda.